quick opening address. Just like to set the stage and remind us sort of why we're all here. Michael has a diverse background that starts in neurosurgery, medical research and biotechnology. For 5 years, he worked as an assistant professor in neurosurgery at the LSU School of Medicine in New Orleans and left that practice to become the CEO of Novafirm Biotech. So starting in the medical industry, has moved on to, currently he's the president of Renewables Investments and the president of Gemini Power Corporation. So I think he brings obviously a breadth of background, but through Gemini has worked hard to empower First Nations through the development of clean technology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Dan.
Thank you, everyone. I want to begin with a couple of confessions. I'm a poor speaker, so forgive me if I read from a prepared text. And also, I'm quite technically incompetent when it comes to microgrids. I'm neither an engineer nor a finance guy, but I do have some experience with remote First Nations communities. And I'm also very interested in public policy and wealth creation. So my topic this morning will be stated in the form of a conclusion. Wealth creation for First Nations communities will be the new public policy. But first, a couple of words about public policy. Public policy, some of you know, is a rather unglamorous field. Just try telling anyone at a cocktail party that you're a senior policy analyst. It's not a very good pickup line. But never underestimate the impact of public policy at both the individual and macro level. In my own family, I can think of two great examples of how wealth is created when individuals align their business activities with public policy. Business activity can be a very good thing for First Nations communities. It can provide a revenue stream to the community, educational opportunities, jobs, or create sustainable wealth. These are all related but distinct concepts, and often there are trade-offs between them. The chief and council may want a revenue stream. Band elders may want to focus on education. And this is where public policy comes in. Without trampling on anyone's right to make their own economic decisions, public policy must be carefully crafted in order to safeguard the interests of all stakeholders, including future generations. In order to understand where First Nations public policy is going, you really only need to consider two things: demographics and economics. The treaties, colonialism, cultural genocide, and idle no more will always come up as important issues, but demographics and economics alone are enough to explain where public policy is headed when it comes to First Nations communities. So Canada's First Nations communities are demographically very young and very fast growing. In Saskatchewan, for example, 20% of the entire province will be Aboriginal by 2015. In northern Saskatchewan, 5 years from now, 45% of first graders will be First Nations. At the national level, over 50% of First Nations are under the age of 25, and child poverty is triple the national average. These are alarming statistics. With few exceptions, living on a reserve has never been the solution to breaking the cycle of poverty. My own immigrant ancestors on my mother's side worked their way out of poverty, in part because they could grow carrots, beets, and corn in the rich soils of St. Boniface, Manitoba, on a farm that they actually owned. Most reserves have notoriously poor soils. In fact, most remote First Nations communities also have mold-infested houses, inadequate water and road infrastructure, poor primary health care, and practically zero economic activity, in addition to notoriously poor soil. So whenever I talk to politicians about the original inhabitants of this country, I try to avoid terms like Turtle Island, because I know it makes them squirm. But I've never seen a politician squirm when I say that there are First Nations living under third world conditions right here in the backyard of one of the richest countries of the world. They usually just lower their eyes and acknowledge that reality. Within a minute or two, the conversation shifts to the Indian Act, as if that were any excuse for offering despair, and only despair, to the fastest growing segment of Canadian society. Under the Indian Act, however, Canadian taxpayers must cover the entire cost of prenatal care of children whose First Nations mothers are addicted to drugs, perinatal health care and immunizations, housing, education, and special education in the case of fetal alcohol syndrome, unemployment benefits because there's no work for young people, detox programs because many of them get into trouble with drugs, incarceration costs because many of them get trouble with the law, and a lifetime of unnecessary medical expenses because of poor lifestyle choices that result in otherwise preventable illnesses such as diabetes, hypertension, and cancer. Most communities, I'm told, manage to scrape together enough money to pay for their members' funerals. This is the economic reality that many remote First Nations communities live with every day. But there's another economic reality I would like to discuss. It's called the fiscal multiplier. It is defined as the ratio of a change in national income to the change in government spending that causes it. And it works like this. When an economy is in recession, governments typically respond in one of two ways. They either enact an austerity program designed to cut back on government expenditure, or they print money and spend it on programs that have a fiscal multiplier greater than 1. This way, for every dollar spent, GDP goes up by more than $1, and eventually the economy grows its way out of recession. Recently, I've had the opportunity to ask some of our national leaders and politicians if they know a fiscal multiplier for reserve communities. To my astonishment, nobody seems to know the answer to this question. Nobody has any hard data on what actually happens to a dollar that's invested in a First Nations owned business or a community owned project. For example, will that dollar always end up in the pocket of some corrupt band council member? Or is there a chance that a dollar invested in a First Nations owned business could generate more than $1 worth of economic activity on and off the reserve, thus enabling the community to grow its way out of poverty? As a budding social scientist, my hypothesis is that the fiscal multiplier for First Nations reserves will be greater than 1 because of the well-established link between socioeconomic status and health. If you dial up the socioeconomic status of a community, you will also observe an incremental improvement in its health. Because the wealthier you are, the better you eat, and the more you take care of yourself. And so, wealthier First Nations will also be healthier First Nations, and healthier First Nations will consume fewer public resources. Again, I am astonished at our collective inability to imagine First Nations communities as anything other than cost centers. Maybe it's time for us to think of First Nations communities, and not just the mining and forestry companies that exploit them, as potential sources of tax revenue. One example that comes to mind are the Isoyus of southern British Columbia, who own their own winery and luxury resort. The Isoyus themselves may not pay much in the way of taxes, but the people who drink their award-winning wine sure do. Or, at the very least, we should think of First Nations reserves as communities whose strain on the healthcare budget can be mitigated through the magic of business activity and improved socioeconomic status. Governments, I'm pleased to say, are finally starting to get it, and wealth creation is becoming the new public policy. So if you're a developer, be prepared for a shift. The government knows about the demographics of Aboriginal communities, and they're looking for ways of lowering the burden on taxpayers. This means that the cost of doing business with remote First Nations communities now involves more than just a few token jobs and free skidoos. If you can demonstrate that a project will create sustainable wealth for a remote First Nation community, then chances are you will delight the politicians. And if you're a remote First Nations community looking for a partner, don't just think about education or jobs. Think about community ownership, or at a minimum, resource revenue sharing. It takes more than an education to pull yourself out of poverty. My grandfather only had a grade 6 education, but he died a millionaire because he owned his home and his land and his business. If you live on a reserve, you're precluded from owning your own home or your own land. But your economic development corporation can own a business, or at least partner in revenue share with a developer. So don't settle for anything less. In 7 generations, your descendants will thank you. In this presentation, I've deliberately steered clear of issues of historical rights and social justice. Not that these issues aren't important, demographics and economic principles alone are enough to justify Aboriginal ownership of energy and natural resource projects. Hopefully in the not too distant future, this will become a matter of public policy and not just a dream